Band Life Podcast! You're listening to the Band Life Podcast, your number one guide on how to run a profitable band. Here are your hosts, Pete Stannard and Adam West, the Wizard of Rock! Hello, and welcome to the Band Life Podcast. I am your host, Pete Stannard, and I am here with the wonderful Wizard of Rock himself, Mr. Adam West. Woo! I know I keep saying I should get like a round of applause thing.
Get it. Put it on your notes.
I should do it. I keep forgetting to do it. I actually have like so much sound effect stuff here at the studio.
Let's annoy people even more with that.
I think it should be
That's even better. To the empty room, innit?
Just a slow clap for Mr. Adam West.
It's ironic when you think about what we talk about. It's like people in the background. Yeah, you're good, mate.
Well, yeah, I love that song. What's with the slow clap? What? Come on, put some energy to it. This topic, I'm interested in doing this topic mainly because I get a lot of we've touched upon this sort of stuff in previous episodes, and I talk about this quite a lot in my content on social media, but because I do a lot of short form content, it's really hard to give the context through. And what I tend to get back, especially from younger artists, is that they kind of question it. So I spend a lot of time in the comments around this subject. Okay. And hopefully this episode will help to clear this up a bit more. But we will see. So, and I think, and it's not anything against younger people as such. I think it's more a case of they don't quite understand it because they didn't live without the internet or without streaming music. Yeah. They don't quite, because why would you learn that? Why would you learn an outdated or outmoded system that doesn't apply to them at that moment in time? And my counter to that is that especially when you get to kind of major record label level of the industry, there are elements of that old school way of doing business that they're still practicing to this day. And the issue comes where those record labels are trying to put a round peg in a square hole, is that the way they're treating artists, especially new and young artists, and especially new and young artists that are gaining notoriety through social media, as opposed to back in the day where artists would get notoriety through things like radio and through playing live in what would be considered either the underground or the alternative scene, depending on how you want to label it. So I think for this conversation as well, I wanted to ground it more in areas that we know. So I want to kind of ground this in the rock and metal world, as it were. Yep. But it doesn't mean that this conversation isn't applicable to all genres, because we are talking broadly about the music industry. So there is elements that are going to be irrelevant, but there's going to be a lot of information here that is applicable, to other genres. The title of this episode is, will underground music ever feed mainstream music again, or is it dead for rock metal bands? For context, I feel like we need to explain how things worked pre the digital era, certainly pre-streaming, but pre-internet, as it were, because the industry was a very different place back then. It was a completely different landscape, as it were, especially when it comes to distribution. The way that things worked back then, back in the day, and I'm going back, pre 2000, certainly into the 90s, definitely the 80s, 70s, and 60s, is that a band generally would blow up on the live scene and on alternative radio or on smaller radio stations. If you're in the States, probably something like college radio. And then this would trigger major labels to show interest, at least, in those bands. And that's when they start to sign these bands off. To kind of put it into a more present day, the underground hip hop scene seems to be feeding into the mainstream. So there's a lot of hip hop artists, particularly featured artists, in the charts.
Yep.
At the moment, the underground of hip hop seems to be feeding that in a way, not in the same way that rock and metal bands do, because generally rock and metal bands aren't featured artists. They're artists of their own, of their own entity, as it were. So the chances of you getting, Taylor Swift featuring James Hetfield or something like that is going to be quite slim, I would say.
It's usually the other way round, where Lulu was featured with Metallica and Lady Gaga, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose so. So there's kind of a little element of that. But I suppose, so if you could bring it to a smaller band, I suppose, numbers-wise, in comparison to hip-hop, that's like, it's 1 out of 100 in comparison as a ratio compared to hip-hop at the moment. As a good example of this, and if people aren't aware of how these things work, please do some research on this. But a good example of this for our era, I suppose, would be Nirvana. We've spoken about Nirvana in our last episode as well, I think.
Surprised we didn't get berated for that.
I'm surprised. Yeah. How dare you talk about Nirvana? But anyway, okay, so to give you an idea of the chronology even of Nirvana, is that in 1989 they signed to Sub Pop. Now, Sub Pop were originally a magazine. They were like a fanzine in Seattle at that time. And what they did was they became a record label because they really loved Soundgarden. The idea was, we sign Soundgarden, we will make them big. And they did that. I mean, Soundgarden, they found success in the late 80s, and they even went on tour with the Use Your Illusions tour with Guns N' Roses, which to this day is the biggest tour ever done. It ran from January of 91 all the way through to July of 93. They played 192 shows in 27 countries. And that's a lot. So, that's a big tour.
I thought Metallica did something like that too, didn't
they? They were on the Use Your Illusions tour. That's how big that tour was.
Oh, right.
That tour was when James Hetfield had his face blown up. That's where he's got all that scarring, on his face and his arm, because all the pyrotechnics blew him up. So, and that was a part of that. So that was one show in that tour.
I thought I recognised the numbers there. I seen it on the T-shirt, 192 shows in 27 countries. Got you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So Soundgarden subsequently signed to A&M Records, and they're the first grunge band to sign to a major label, which most people think it's Nirvana, but it's not. It's actually Soundgarden. And in my humble opinion, they were the band that really forged grunge worldwide, but they did it more through live playing, through gigging, through touring, as opposed to the way that Nirvana broke through, which is more towards getting into the Billboard chart with Smells Like Teen Spirit.
Well, only quickly, Pete. Sorry, mate.
No, feel free. Go for it. Mate.
So you got Sub Pop was a magazine. So was Sub Pop the ones that initiated the Use Your Illusion world tour? Then
no, they signed.
They were the catalyst.
Yeah, so they signed basically the bulk of the bands, the Seattle grunge bands of the time, but their first signing was Soundgarden, and the reason they became a record label was because of Soundgarden. So they pivoted on what they were doing so that they can concentrate their efforts on Soundgarden itself as a record label. And then subsequently they signed Nirvana and Hole and the Screaming Trees, loads of different grunge bands at that time. So Sub Pop, I don't think they exist anymore. Last I saw, there was a documentary that Dave Grohl did, and he went back to Seattle, and there's a Sub Pop shop in Seattle Airport that sells like all the old school Sub Pop stuff, and I think that's kind of their headquarters now. That's all they do is kind of sell merch.
All right. So who did? So who set up the Use Your Illusion World Tour with all these bands on there?
Whoever was signed. I think they were signed to Geffen at the time.
Interesting.
Certainly with Appetite for Destruction album, they were signed to Geffen. I think that was their major label, so they would have set that up,
right?
With them. But that's a big tour, And as
massive,
the other band to mention here is Faith No More, another big band of the time. They played on that tour as well, the Use Your Illusions tour. It's a big thing. Certainly in our world, to play that many shows over that amount of time in that many countries as well.
And that must have took a lot of setting up, didn't it?
Yeah, that's a big undertaking. I mean,
that's massive.
Do you think they all had 12K followers? Yeah. So yeah. I mean, this wasn't a small tour. This weren't small venues either. This was a stadium venue. They played like Wembley Stadium and things like that. So it wasn't like these were just like little clubs and things like that. And
These days are long gone, aren't they, man?
This was a sellout tour. Going back to Nirvana, so they signed in '89 to Sub Pop, and they released their album Bleach. And then in '91 they signed to Geffen. Going back to Guns N' Roses. Guns N' Roses were signed to Geffen. And they released Smells Like Teen Spirit, which then propelled them into the mainstream. And the grunge scene exploded. But another example of that is the old faithful Metallica themselves. I mean, they were originally signed to Megaforce. I mean, for a metal outfit to sign to a record company called Megaforce. So they were a small indie record label back in '83. They signed, and then they signed to Elektra in '86, which is an old school record company. Elektra formed in the '50s.
Wow.
But they are a subsidiary of Warner, so technically they signed to a major label. This isn't just a US thing. Oasis, for example, they first signed to Creation, which was an independent, and then moved on to Epic and Columbia, which are both owned by Sony. And I put this one in for you. I'm going to test you, see if you're reading the notes.
I am reading the notes.
Black Sabbath. You're looking at it. You're going to ruin it. I was going to say, guess who they signed to?
Oh, I don't know.
I don't know. I can't think of Philips, the electrical company.
Interesting.
Which is another interesting thing, because back then, and I think again, don't really quote me on this, but I think the way that things really sort of started out was electronic tech companies would sign artists for a very specific reason. Is that if you're producing record players, it makes sense to invest in artists to make records. Kind of the gun bullet kind of theory of, well, you can produce the best gun in the world. If you haven't got any bullets to go with it, it's basically a lump of metal. So Philips, yeah, they signed Black Sabbath, but they are part of Universal Music Group. So you're part of UMG. So it's not like they did it completely by themselves. But that, to kind of buck that trend that we're talking about, that was a major label. That was their first signing. So, but it was a very different time. You're going back kind of the very late 60s, early 70s sort of thing. So
Small world, Dr. John.
yeah, but it shows how it is. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's good. It's a good bit of information for people who are listening to us.
Yeah, it's something to keep in mind of. And I actually did a post about this, about how tech companies now, as in Spotify, they're not going to invest in the music industry like how Philips did back in the day, purely because they don't have that vested interest. So, and this is my problem with software engineers being at the top of the music industry, is that their mindset is going to be more about investing in tech because they're a tech business. So a company like Philips, for example, even though they're a tech business, they looked at it from the point of view of, well, we have to invest in the music industry to sell records. If people buy records, they're going to buy record players. So the issue now is that someone like Daniel Ek doesn't have to make that investment because he's already got the artists doing all the work. You know, this is the kind of the genius thing about things like Spotify and social media as well, is that they're getting people to do all the work and they're not paying them for it. Why would
Well, it's
they?
not
They don't
clever
have to.
business, is it? It's cruel business. But they look at it as go, I just seen an opportunity. And you're like,
Well, I say it is clever from their perspective. Hard, cold-hearted business person, then that makes sense. Like, you know, if a company could drive down wages, then profits increase because wages are a cost, and they're not a cost that you can kind of get back.
just bring in the machines then.
Bring in-
Don't drag people along. It's cracking me up,
Automate
this
it.
stuff.
Yeah, it's one of those things. But that's a whole other deeper discussion.
Okay, yeah, we won't get into that.
Yeah, that's
'cause
a whole other-
We'll upset the fans. Okay.
The other thing to keep in mind is how deals worked back then. Broadly speaking, what you would have is you would have a record deal and possibly a distribution deal. Now, the distribution deal is where the major labels really come into their own because they have the logistical network. I'm going back pre-internet, okay, here, okay. So these are the days when you record your album and then that goes off and it gets pressed. It goes to a pressing depot and they will press off hundreds of thousands of copies if you're being distributed worldwide. And then they are boxed up, they are put into a lorry, and then they are delivered to record shops where people would go and buy the records.
Bring
I
that
know.
day back.
There's obviously there's advantages to the way things were, but there's advantages to the way things are as well, because now everyone can distribute globally. Whereas before, you had to be in a very select group of people, a very select group of artists could distribute worldwide. You know, the Metallicas, the Guns N' Roses, the big legacy bands now, yes, they were in that subset, you know, kind of the U2s, those sorts of bands. Smaller bands, you would distribute, you know, nationally, maybe territorially. So if you're in Europe, it would be within Europe. If you're in the US, you know, the US, depending where you are geographically. And you would have to break those territories to then become a much bigger act. The reason that I'm talking about this is because smaller independent labels back then didn't have the distribution channels, the infrastructure to ship albums and singles and merchandise and all the other stuff that you could buy in like HMV. HMV, you can buy records, CDs, tapes and stuff like that, but you could also get posters, t-shirts, bobbleheads, hats, all the other stuff, the paraphernalia that goes with it. So all of that stuff has to be physically shipped from one place to another, and the major labels would provide that infrastructure. And this is why most bands went from independents to majors, because they just simply outgrew the independents, because they just couldn't physically distribute the demand for their songs, for their albums, for their merchandise, and for everything else. A tiny label like Sub Pop couldn't distribute Nirvana when they signed to Geffen. That's why they signed to Geffen, because they wanted.
Makes sense. Yeah.
It makes sense for the bands and for the artist. And this is why I always get a little bit kind of like, did they sell out? You get a lot of people, that band sold out. It's like, did they, or did they just outgrow where they were?
Interesting.
At the end
That's
of the day.
a very interesting point, because it does get raised quite a bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the amount of bands that get accused, they've sold out, and it's just like, okay, well, maybe they just want a bigger audience. What's wrong with that at the end of the day?
What is selling out anyway? I mean, when somebody says that you sold out, it's like, well, if I'm growing as a band, then my audience is going to grow, and if I need to reach that audience, if there's interest, then I can't do that on my own. I need the support of somebody else. It's not selling out.
Trying to keep in mind that you had a record deal and a distribution deal, and they were generally two different things. And sometimes it would be the label would sign the distribution deal as a sort of kind of a third entity, as it were. But sometimes the record label would sign just for the production of records, and then the artist would sign a distribution deal, and they would run sort of in parallel, as it were. I think kind of the main point here is that most bands on an independent level, once they get to a certain level, they need they certainly needed the majors for growth and to be distributing further out into the world, into the globe. Through these deals, that's kind of how underground artists would feed into the mainstream, whether that's through the Billboard charts or through playing live. Like Nirvana gained notoriety through selling records, whereas bands like Soundgarden and Faith No More and things like that, they got more notoriety through playing live and touring on big tours, like the Use Your Illusions tours. The main point here is that the artists need that infrastructure there in the first place, because Guns N' Roses were obviously signed to a major label for that tour to happen. So you've got that connection there. And Nirvana needed Geffen. They needed their distribution channels so they could sell the records. So because the Billboard charts are built on how many albums you sell. That's how they work out who's number one at the end of the day. If you're going to sell lots of records, then you have to, back then, you had to have those records physically in shops for people to buy. The problem now is that music's just not being consumed in that way. Streaming has obviously become a bigger thing now. So do you want some numbers, some streaming numbers? So this is how people, how much airtime and things like that people are doing. So in the third quarter of 2023, there were 713.4 million music subscribers globally, which was up 90 million on the previous year, which was 623.4 million. Now, this matters kind of for two reasons. It means that we're nearly 3/4 of the way to 1 billion subscribers globally. That's no small achievement. So there's a lot of audience there, I suppose. It's kind of that. To kind of put that into context, I suppose, as recently as 5 years ago, we had only 250 million. So 750 million people have subscribed to the streaming sites over the last 5 years, which is a huge number of people yeah, at the end of the day. And the fact that kind of the second reason is that 90 million subscribers in the 12 months between the third quarter in 2023, that's 83.5 million more than the year before. So,
And what, that's 2023 shit, man.
yeah, so that's only last year. That's the tail end of last year. So it's not even a year ago. It's a very saturated place, obviously, but the advantages are that anyone with a phone can reach 1 billion people with their music, which I think is a great thing. It means that people like you and I can distribute like that. From a distribution perspective, it is. The downside to that is that anyone with a phone can distribute. So the levels of saturation become way, 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 way higher.
And there's a phone for every person on the planet, pretty much now. That's
Yeah. 8
even-
billion people.
Well, I suppose I don't think that number's correct anyway. 8 billion. I mean, how can it be? If you've got,
It's an estimate, yeah.
Especially looking at those numbers there. If you've got, like you said, the downside is it's highly saturated.
Yeah.
Then you run into all sorts of problems, like the title of this podcast. Is that and the way we've gone with music now a result of why rock and metal is well, dead for underground music ever.
And this is the question. This is one of the things that I'm kind of like meh. Kind of.
Well, this is why we're doing. This is why we do the show.
This is why we're talking about it. Yeah, definitely. So I think that the other side of this is radio as well. A medium that I think a lot of artists kind of forget about and disregard beyond like BBC introducing or something like that.
No one's got the attention span anymore because everything's so saturated. People are like, it's a bit like this, right? If you give, I don't know, let's say you give a baby that sweet thing they like, and you keep on giving it to them constantly, eventually they'll even though it's really nice, they're going to get bored and they'll want more. It's like if you keep feeding the beast too long, eventually it outgrows itself, I think, and then it's just like, right, I've consumed everything, what's next? And I think this is where like the music's going at the moment. It's got so saturated, and maybe this is the key thing to the issues most of us are having, is that it's so saturated that we're like, well, all right, where do we go now? Like it's like now you're talking about AI, which we've talked about in the previous episode, and I'm like, okay, so what happens now? And I think that's why there's been a big increase in vinyl and how that's sold CD. And I just think people maybe are like, do you know what? What's this thing that everybody keeps talking about? Vinyl and cassettes and all that. What? And then they want to get into that. And I just think, okay, well, maybe we're going full circle again and getting back into that, because
maybe
to actually have something tangible and in your hand that you can open up and look at and read and absorb. I think this is why like a lot of people are going out to nature a bit more, because they're like, everything's like, it's like this, consume, and you're like, oh, some people are just like, man, it's too much. Like you said, look at those figures there for like 83.5 million more subscribers than the year before. That's huge. That's massive.
It's a lot of people, and all their subscribers as well. You think that's not? I suppose technically that's not taking into account people that are listening to Spotify for free.
Will the underground music ever feed mainstream music again? Honestly, I think it will, but I think we have to outrun what's here at the moment, because I think we've seen some entrepreneurs elitists, people with a bit of money and a bit of capital, and go business opportunity, business opportunity, business opportunity, and you're like, okay, it's a great idea. But like, what it's like everything. Everybody thought it was great getting it to Facebook, and then everybody realizes CIA controlled, and you're just like, huh? Oh, what does that mean? It's like, well, whatever. But it's like, it's like, well, we want to talk to our friends. Like, great. But then you get into it, and then all of a sudden they go, let's change the algorithms. We're only going to put certain posts up that gravitate to you. And it got me thinking. Then, like, well, does the digital music platforms work the same way then? Because a lot of stuff now is controlled by algorithms, and it's like your content doesn't get seen unless it's a specific thing. So now it's almost like your control doesn't seem like it's within your hands anymore.
Yeah, I mean, because the algorithms generally will work on a like basis, so it will show you stuff that you've liked previously, but it's also a flawed thing. So like my wife, she loves cat videos, and I can't. I'm not fussed. So, but the other day because my wife does pottery. She loves pottery. She likes making bowls and cups and stuff like that. And I saw a cat video of this cat doing, like, throwing on a wheel, doing pottery. So I sent her that video, and now my Instagram is just full of cat videos because it's the algorithm's going, well, you clearly like this, and I'm like, no, I don't. I don't particularly like it, but I thought it was a nice thing to share to my wife because she likes cats and she likes pottery, so it makes sense. But I think kind of sort of coming back around is that sort of back in the day, radio was a dominant thing, obviously. Radio play was probably the most important thing in the music industry for bands to get on because it was the way that people discovered music. It's been declined, but it's still the number one way that people find music, oddly enough. And the numbers don't lie. I mean, it is decreasing. It's gone down 15 percentage points over the last 10 years, from 2014 to 2023, going from 52% to 37% of listeners. And the streaming numbers are obviously the other way. They're going up, going from 12% to 19%. That's listening time. And that, I think that includes podcasts as well. So it's not just music, that's just generally listening to stuff. The numbers from radio, they're not terrible yet, but they are on a downward trend, which, depending on your viewpoint on this, I suppose.
Well, I mean, maybe it's because, like, let's say you tune into a podcast.
Yeah.
And it says, I don't know, aliens, real or not. And you're like, right, okay. So you want to listen to that podcast because of that title. But if that person isn't talking about that, and they're rabbiting on, and you're like, okay, well, then you go off it quickly, don't you? So it is, the thing I've noticed with podcasts and radio is like, unless you really get into it straight away, like music, if you listen to music straight on the streaming, you're going to get the music. You're not going to get the band going, hi, and welcome to our album. Before we play, you're like, I just want to listen to the music. I don't want to listen to you talk. So and I think maybe that's, with the radio thing is probably not as high.
And it's the other, because I generally, I'm not a radio listener. My wife is. My wife constantly listens to the radio. I much more put a record on and listen to it, love. That's what I say to her quite a lot. And she's like, well, no, I just want to listen to the radio. So she puts the radio on. And my biggest gripe is that it's just the same songs over and over again. So she listens to Absolute Radio, and they even have like what's called the no repeat guarantee. That no repeat guarantee
only after 8 hours.
Well, it's only like during the daytime, so it's only like 9 till 5. But if you listen the next day, it's the same songs repeated again, just in a slightly different order. So they have their playlists and things like that, and that's what kind of gets me. There's nothing on there that I particularly.
There's enough music in
that
the
I
world.
can't get from Spotify or from Apple Music or wherever, or YouTube or wherever. Plus, I don't have to listen to a DJ drone on. I'm a bit like you. I don't want to listen to a DJ banging on about whatever.
It's
And
hard,
plus,
isn't it?
well, the only other thing that's like maybe the news is in there, so she likes to sort of catch up on the news and that sort of thing, bless her. But it all comes down to personal preference, I think, at the end of the day, and how you like to listen to music. I like to put a vinyl on, sit down in my own headspace and listen to it and actually do nothing else but listen. But most people, most casual listeners, I suppose, quote unquote, they put music on and they're doing it while they work, they're doing it while they're working out, they're doing it while they're driving and all this other stuff. So most people, that's the way they consume music. And if you're going to appeal to the masses, then that's where you've got to be able to place yourself. You have to think along the lines of the casual listener and how they are consuming music and how your music is placed within their world. And for most of the time, it's in a car on the way to work or on the way back from work, or it's down the gym doing their thing, or they're out for a walk, or generally they're doing something else. I personally think sitting down and listening to music, it's always been a minority. A
Because
lot
we're too
of
busy working and trying.
well, even when I was a kid, when I first sort of got into music, I would sit down and listen to music, but the vast majority of my friends weren't. They would, a lot of them didn't even listen to music. Most of the time they'd just, all the music would be on the radio, and putting a vinyl on just seemed like a pain in the ass. Is that sort
Well,
of
it is a
thing.
pain in the ass. You want about scratching it, but there's
It
something
is.
quite ethereal about it, isn't it?
There's something very, I suppose, for me, there's something very nostalgic
Yes, I love it.
about it as well. So,
Long
so I
live vinyl.
suppose if kind of jarring this back, if the distribution stuff is irrelevant now, because most bands are streaming, most artists are streaming, so why would you want to sign to a major label? I suppose. And I kind of sat there and thought about this, like, well, why are they signing? If the distribution stuff's irrelevant, then why do it? I was like, well, what do majors bring to the table at the end of the day? And the thing that I could kind of come up with is obviously a larger budget for production, marketing, and your general living costs, as in for advances and things like that. But I have to say this, advances are a loan. You have to pay them back. Okay. Very important. You do not see a penny from your production until your advance is paid back. It's called a recoupment deal, and it's a standard deal no matter what other bits and bobs they put into that deal. Your advance will always have to be paid back. So if they loan you 100 grand, you will not see a penny from any kind of royalties or anything else until that 100 grand is paid back. But the other parts that majors bring is things like publishing and other industry networking and things like that, and a certain level of credibility going forward as well. So if you're looking to sign a new deal beyond the deal that you're in, to be turning around to other labels saying, well, we were just signed to Universal, for example, that brings a certain level of credibility for future signings and how better that deal is going to be. It gives you more leverage going forward because you've got that credibility there as such, unless you've really kind of messed up in some way. The other thing that I thought about was how those trends have worked over the last kind of 30 years, I suppose, since the 90s, which I feel is kind of significant and kind of relevant to this conversation, because these are the bands that came up from the underground, and there's a definite kind of cut off for this. So we had grunge in the early to mid 90s. So that's bands like Nirvana, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Stone Temple Pilots, all those kind of Seattle bands, but also Smashing Pumpkins, which is they're based in Chicago and things like that. Then in the mid to late 90s, we had Britpop and kind of the new metal thing in the States in particular. So with Britpop, it was obviously Oasis and Blur. For the new metal thing, it was like Limp Bizkit, Korn, and the Deftones and things like that. But then in the early to mid 2000s, we had the post-punk revival, which was bands like the White Stripes, the Killers, Kings of Leon in the States. Whereas over here we had like the Libertines, the Kaiser Chiefs, and the Arctic Monkeys and stuff like that, if you remember those. And then we start to get into an area, a little grey area, certainly for me. Maybe I missed it. But have you ever heard of landfill indie?
Still, it doesn't sound very encouraging, does it?
It doesn't. But apparently late 2000s to 2010 with bands like the Pigeon Detectives, the Fratellis and the Rifles, they would be considered... I've heard of the Pigeon Detectives and the Fratellis. The Rifles I'm not too au fait. I've heard the name, things like that, but no. And then from 2011 onwards... just some kind of terms have been thrown around in things like the NME and things like that, like post-punk, crank wave, and my favourite one of all, post-Brexit new wave. So I don't even know where to start with that. But these trends, quote unquote, they've never taken off, not in any kind of significant way anyway, not like how grunge or Britpop was taking off. So, we can safely say that there hasn't been certainly a significant movement since 2010, possibly even going back as far as 2000, which is like, the best part of 25 years now. So there's a few kind of bigger questions to ask around that. Is that, overall, I suppose, I'm going to ask you these questions, Mr. West.
Oh.
Okay. Can rock and metal artists afford not to sign to major labels if they want to move their careers beyond the independent level? Broadly speaking, I mean, obviously there's going to be some outliers that have kind of broken through independently, but
I don't know.
Broadly
speaking, can rock and metal artists afford not to sign? Well, I suppose it really depends what they want. If the music industry has changed, which it has, the way we do things now has changed. If you don't adapt, you get left behind, is the old saying from Gregor McIntosh from Paradise Lost, really, which is why their music in their band has changed through the different eras, because they have to adapt, otherwise they get left behind.
Yeah,
I suppose it depends how much you want. I mean, for me, it is a very grey area, because
it's because the important part is that they want to move beyond the independent level. So that's what they want.
Yeah, but it no longer works, as we've just been talking about. These why would you sign the major labels when you can stream everything and do it all yourself on the mobile phone?
Well, because of the things that I set out as
larger budget
publishing,
production.
bigger budget, bigger production, bigger tours and things like that coming.
Well, I don't know.
Play.
I think it's a bit sketchy for anybody to do that these days now. Especially, so you're asking me the question, I'd be like, well, my band, I've never wanted to sign, because I've always felt that you get exploited. I think there's an awful lot that you don't consider that is out of your control once you sign. How much you sign over, how much of the rights to your own music you don't have. That's always been a big issue for me, right? But they could, as you say, they could argue by saying, well, there's budget, production, marketing, living costs, publishing. It's like, sure. I know a few people online that pretty much can cover most of that themselves. There's some highly intelligent young artists that are doing most of that. Obviously, they don't have the reach, but you see some bands that just explode. I'm like, what happened there? And you're like, well, I did this, this, and this because I knew how the market and the industry
Yeah.
works today. And you're like, well, so you didn't need any of that? And they're like, nope. I'm like, well, there you go
Okay.
then. I
What?
mean,
Who is that though?
I think it's a band called Calva Louise.
Okay, yeah, I've seen them online.
Yeah.
Are they not signed?
I don't think so, but don't quote me. I've seen a few of the videos, right?
Yeah.
The girl that does all the singing, she's quite talented. She plays piano. She's been working with Unreal Engine to create a music video that she did herself, and she used the
Yeah.
social platforms and pushed that out there. And they're playing the big crowds of stadiums. I'm like, maybe there's another story to it that I haven't come across. Maybe she has had a bit of outside help, but I just look at a couple of things that they're doing. I'm thinking, well, that's all on her terms, really.
Yeah.
They've done that themselves. That's a lot of work for it. Like we talked about. Kudos to me taking on what I do, but
Yeah.
these big labels, they're like, well, we'll do all that, and you're like, yeah, but you want my soul, and it's not for sale.
Yeah. Yeah, and I
you
think
know,
that, and I think personally, I think that there's always room for negotiation. I think if you just take the first deal that comes along because someone's throwing a load of money at you, then you're probably going to end up with a crappy deal. But and I think also this is why certainly major record labels like to sign young, impressionable artists, because in a roundabout way they're kind of easier to manipulate, because the sorts of numbers, certainly financially, that you're dealing with are probably the sort of money that they've never seen before. Whereas someone like me, I've dealt with hundreds of thousands of pounds of stuff. I've bought houses and things like that, and it's not such a daunting thing once you've been through that. So if someone was to offer me 100 grand, to sign a deal, and I'm like, well, the first thing I'm going to say is, well, how much are you getting off the back end, and let's see what we can do about that. Whereas someone, 18-year-old me would probably be like, oh, 100 grand, wow, great, brilliant.
yeah.
I'm done for the rest of my life. And it's like, actually, mid 40s me is like 100 grand. That's not going to last too long. Not with the house, the kids, and all the rest of it.
Not when you've got a business mindset.
But exactly. So it's one of those things that that all comes with age and experience. And please don't take that the wrong way if you're a young person listening to this. Because I would be the same. 18, 20-year-old me would be like, yay, this is great. I am going to get absolutely hammered with 100 grand. You're not going to see me for months, but I am going to have the happiest time of my life. So I get it. I perfectly understand it. But, fast forward, 30s, 40s, your life perspective becomes a lot more different. And the way in which that you can interact with people that are seemingly with power becomes a very different perspective, and becomes a very different animal, because you do have the guts to turn around and say, no, I don't want it. I don't want it because it's shit. At the end of the day, long term, this doesn't work out very well for me. That's I think, going back to the actual question, can rock metal artists afford not to sign? Again, like any kind of lawyer would say, it depends on the deal, I think, for me.
So maybe we need a new deal then.
So the next question I have for you, sir, is
Here we go.
will we ever have an event like grunge, Britpop, or new metal again?
No. Since the introduction of probably the early 2000s digital music, we're at this point now, this precipice of, well, is it gonna die or get better, right? And I think anything that's coming out now, I really think we are at a point now, music, where nobody really knows where to go, what to do, or what's next. I don't think, to answer the question, I don't think we're ever going to get back to that. I don't know where we are going to go. Some of us, probably yourself as well, are at that point where we're like, this is the sort of era of music we got into, and we're going to stick with that. I mean, look at AC/DC and Black Sabbath as an example. They've been doing the same music for like a couple of decades, and it still works.
And maybe that will be the next explosion.
Maybe I like to
So
think so.
maybe that's the thing, and that kind of leads quite nicely onto the next question: is rock metal genres or genre overdue a significant mainstream trend?
Yes.
Or do we have to accept that we're in a certain lane and we need to stick to it? Like how Noel Gallagher said about Harry Styles. They would tell him to shut his face, put a dress on and go and sing that fucking song.
I know. And he's lived all that.
He's lived all that. He's one of the legacy bands, I suppose you could call
I'd like to think he's one of these that kind of looked at him and gone, okay, I'm a little arrogant and a little bit up my own ass at times. Well, I'm being polite, okay? Yeah. And I'm like, but he's probably looked at that and gone, well, I got the collateral now, the money behind me. It's like, no, I'm not fucking doing that. Like I think people like him now are starting to see how the system's really doing one on the artist, and he's like, well, no, I'm not doing that, and I can afford to do it because I have a name.
Yeah.
I'm in that position to say that, and I don't give a fuck because you don't. And it's like, well, no, it's not right, is it? And you know, he made some good points in that little thing that we seen, and I think there's a few other people doing the same. They're just like, well, you know, yeah, I think there will be a revival of some old school, and you could argue by saying, have we really reached the end then of music? You're like, well, in terms of our existence, I mean, look, there's a whole saying in it: history always repeats itself. So does music always repeat itself? Has music and what we've listened to throughout history, has that repeated itself?
Maybe, I don't know, because I suppose if you're going to take that logic, then you know, classical should be making a resurgence. Anyway, because you can't get more historical than Bach.
Okay. So what?
But saying that,
what are Opeth doing? Very classically.
Saying that, I occasionally listen to classical music, and I was listening to Bach the other day, and he has over 2 million monthly listeners on Spotify. So, you know, that's not a number to be sniffed at. For someone who's been dead for 500 years and has no social media, as far as I'm aware.
Elvis is another one.
Bless it, Elvis. Yeah, I'm sure he's got millions of monthly listeners. Yeah. So, and
let's find out.
So you're gonna have a little look. What's Elvis Presley's monthly listenership?
Elvis Presley has
Got on how many million?
22,850,433 monthly listeners.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Okay, every song with over 1 billion Spotify streams. This is on Visual Capitalist. Okay. Oh, this is actually quite interesting. I'd love to screenshot this. This is fucking phenomenal. You got to look at this.
All right, well, screen it. This? Yeah, go for it. And then we can describe it for the listeners. For those of you on the YouTube, you're going to see this. But so this is a list of artists with over 1 billion streams. Is this specifically to Spotify, or is this streaming in general?
Top 5, Ed Sheeran. So we can.
He's got 11 songs, and then below him you've got Post Malone with 9 songs, and then The Weeknd with nine songs. Extinction. Wow. Okay. 8 songs. Ariana Grande is there. For those listening, so the chart, at the top, we're going from the 1970s onwards, and it's per decade. So you've got 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. And I would hedge my bets as we go down, there will be more artists in the billions club than that were in the 70s, if that makes sense. Because obviously there was no streaming in the 70s.
Yeah, so it's very thin. So at the top, you've literally got in the 70s, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, possibly 6, 7.
And what's really interesting is Queen there. Queen has like 3 dots. And
yeah, so
considering they've just sold their stuff going from 70s into the 80s.
Well, Queen's most played "Don't Stop Me Now," 1.4 billion streams.
Yeah.
So even though it was release date in the 70s, they're streaming. It's been streamed on Spotify 1.4 billion times, and then in the 80s, the track by Queen is Bohemian Rhapsody. Was a surprise, 17 billion times. So yeah, if we go down,
That's a big number, isn't it?
that's
70.
that's lucky a lot. Like, I mean, it generates a lot of capital. Surely 2000s. Interesting because
Yeah, and I love the way that also you're going rock band, rock band, rock band, rock band, and then you kind of when you hit the 2000s, that's where it's we've still got the Killers in there, but beyond that, it's Eminem, lots of Eminem, Bruno Mars, lots of Eminem, Snoop Dogg's in there, so it's now getting into much more hip hop, R&B stuff.
which kind of is what we're kind of talking about a little just now.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And then, so this is now like funneling out. It's like,
yeah, look at that.
Yeah. So
Massive. So we've
when we
literally
get
got,
into, so when we get into the 2010s, it becomes much more of a splay. Wow, it gets really big in 2010
That's
with
massive.
the amount of artists now hitting 1 billion streams.
But then you notice one thing about this as well. I haven't seen any metal bands in there.
No, I mean the closest thing. I mean,
Because
even
it's based on
21
1 billion.
Pilots, I suppose, but even they would be considered kind of poppy, rocky sort of stuff.
This is great. This is a great. I love the way they've done this. This is clever.
Yeah, no, it's a great way of doing it. Yeah, it really does kind of illustrate how this has changed over the decades. Wow. Okay. So right down the bottom, we've got a plethora of artists that, ranging from obviously Ed Sheeran, Lewis Capaldi, Post Malone is a lot, Billie Eilish. I'm just kind of picking out ones. Imagine Dragons. They're kind of rocky, I suppose, ish. But certainly nothing metal, nothing like...
No, it's just the pop industry, Ariana Grande, Malone, Post Malone again.
But then I
Few of them are,
suppose, I suppose that kind of should be reflective. Pop should be the most popular genre.
It's easy listening.
It's
isn't
kind
it?
of in the name. But Post Malone, I mean,
Popular.
did you hear him on the Howard Stern show? He did a version of Them Bones by Alice in Chains, and it was awesome. He sounded really great. So well worth checking out. He's got a really good rock voice. He should be doing rock.
Well, he kind of looks like a metaler with all them
He
tattoos.
should
doesn't
do. He should do. with
Just
all
needs
this
a leather
tattoo
jacket.
on his face. Just needs a leather jacket and a Harley. He'll be there. But no, that's really interesting. I like that. Right. So and now right into the 2020s. But it is actually looking at that. There is a bit of an inward curve there.
Yeah.
So it's almost hourglass. I think if you put like into the 2030s, that might actually sort of start to come back in as a shape. So at the top, it's very narrow and it widens out. And then it's almost like...
It looks like a set of lungs, doesn't it? It looks like the esophagus and the lungs.
It does kind of... But at the bottom there, it is really starting to sort of curve in. So maybe there is a trend, a downward trend for pop in that.
That's Elton John, Cold Heart. It's a remix.
Yeah.
So what we got here, 2010 to probably 2000. So we got what would we say here, 2015, something like that.
Yeah.
That's quite a massive breadth. Isn't it?
That's where the kind of the widest part of this illustration is. So that's got obviously the most artists.
Well, when did James Arthur come out?
Well, you could probably do it like Ed Sheeran.
So before him, wasn't it?
So The Shape of You. So he's kind of at the bottom of that. But he's got like five spots there. So he's got 5 songs. But Thinking Aloud he's at the top of that. So there's obviously sort of 2 different releases there. The top 3 albums there.
Top 3 albums. Divide is the most streamed album on Spotify by Ed Sheeran.
Do you know what's really interesting though is that I don't see the Beatles in there at all.
Ah, shit.
So the smallest is 1 billion, and then you've got a middle-sized one which is 2 billion, and then a bigger size than that. Obviously,
So-
the largest, which is 3 billion.
So for those listening, we're waving our little cursor over the circles, and obviously the main one that sticks out there is Queen Bohemian Rhapsody,
Yeah.
which have streamed 17 billion times.
Yeah, so
on
that should be a
Spotify.
much bigger circle. I mean, Sgt. Pepper's is the largest selling album ever, and the
Interesting.
Beatles aren't even here.
Like they got a mixed bag at the top there, and like
Yeah, I mean that's the other interesting part is that you have such a variance of genres within this as well.
Hotel California, September, Sweet Alabama, Dreams, Highway
Yeah.
to Hell, Don't Stop Me Now. Yeah, well, what
But
is
you
the billions
don't
go?
really have. I mean, beyond the Chili Peppers, you don't really have any kind of funk. You don't have any.
Poppy, innit?
Well, because you would have thought someone like Stevie Wonder or someone like that would be there.
Okay, it kind of says a lot, doesn't it, about the Indian pop world, at least.
Back to the question
Yeah.
was, should artists just stay in their lane, and kind of be happy with where they're at?
Well, if you're making a lot of money through the streams and those kind of stats, then
Yeah, but if you were to look at that, rock and metal's not the place to do it at the end of the day.
I think a lot of us know that anyway, don't we? It's
Yeah.
it's where the world is right now. I mean, it's a bit cliche, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's easy listening for most people. They're like, I want some easy listening, and they'll put some background music on. So it
Yeah.
doesn't have. Sometimes that music doesn't have a lot of substance, does it?
Yeah, but I suppose that it comes back to what I was saying earlier about the casual listener. Yeah, I don't consider myself to be a casual listener because I will sit down and listen to music and do nothing else but listen to music. But for most people, the vast majority of people, I would say, of the how many 700 odd million, best part of 1 billion people, a large number of that of those people just listen to music casually. And it's kind of difficult for music artists to get their head around that because a lot of the time they're not casual listeners, and the concept of being a casual listener to music artists can be quite a bizarre thing for them because it's not what they do. And a lot of most people have their own worldview.
You're also as part of your job as well, so it's
Yeah. So that kind of leads us to quite a nice segue into the last question
warm.
is,
go.
should rock metal artists take a page from hip hop and try to feature with pop artists in an attempt to break the mainstream? So out of those, that list, I suppose, which would be quite, because Post Malone's in there, and he does, like I said to you, like he did on the Howard Stern show, he did doing Alice in Chains covers. I think he does Rooster by Alice in Chains as a part of his live set. I've seen that. I think he's a big Alice in Chains fan. So to feature on some of his tracks as an artist might be a really good way of breaking through. Or someone like him. Obviously, it's going to be a quite difficult if you're a brand new metal band to go, I'm just going to pop on Post Malone's new song. That's probably outside the sphere of what you can do, but kind of bringing it into someone that's slightly above your level, quote unquote, working with them and featuring on their stuff in
Collaboration.
some way. And it wouldn't be the first. Slash played guitar with Michael Jackson famously.
Yeah.
So it's not outside of the realms of a crossover
I can't disagree with it, to be
being
honest.
featured. so maybe if artists were rock metal artists were thinking more along those lines, being a bit more open-minded to, maybe I could work with such and such in this genre and try to leverage their audience a bit more, maybe they would progress slightly more within the industry in that way. But then it's kind of gets down to the details of how to contact them, how would you do it, how does that work within the confines of songwriting and things like that.
Well, I think a few of the major ones have already done that anyway. So I don't know. It's whether or not, because it's not a simple answer. I suppose. Well, it is, but it isn't. I mean, let's use Metallica for instance. Let's just say they didn't. Well, they did, but let's just say they wanted to stick to their metal. If they wanted to hit into the pop scene and get up there in the Billions Club, they would really have to sort of swallow their pride and go, I'm going to delve into a bit of pop. How are we going to manage that? Because it separates the fan base then, because they already lost a few fans when they did Load and Reload. And so it's like, it's that problem then, isn't it? In terms of your, where you stand as a band with your fans.
Yeah.
This is the trouble when you do, like, if you take Creator or Testament, and they were like, right, we're gonna do a collaboration with fucking Taylor Swift, right? And they'd be like, okay, because sorry, the fans are like, dude, have you sold out or what have you? And you're like, well, is there a reasoning behind it?
But then, sorry to interject, but then
cool.
Going back to how you described how bands sold out, what if they did that song with Taylor Swift, the 8th best guitarist in the world? What if that song was really good? Would they have sold out then? What if that song is still a Testament song? It's got Taylor Swift singing on it.
Look, bottom line, right? If the music sounds good, what does it matter?
Exactly. So maybe it's more. It reflects more on the audience and the fan base than it does on the artist.
Well, it's the audience and the fan base that end up giving you the sales, and you're like, well, then you got to sit down and go, is that a good move? Because we could lose a few millions. Like, yeah, but we could also gain a few million if we go down the Taylor Swift route. And you're like,
I can't really see Testament that Taylor Swift combining in that way, because I think the Taylor Swift fans will be like, well, what are we listening to beyond this sort of thing? The same with the Testament thing. So there's got to be that kind of. That's why I use Post Malone as quite a good example, because he's clearly in more of the kind of poppy area, but there's already that foundation, that groundwork there, because he covers a lot of Alice in Chains stuff. So if you're finding an artist, and again, this is what comes down to, if I was going to go down this route as an artist, I would do my research and I would look for artists that have that kind of foundation. Is it listed in their influences and things like that? I do pop, but I also really like Slipknot, or also really like Metallica, or also really like Kiss, or all that sort of stuff. And then you can kind of go, okay, well, I've got this song that's a bit Kiss-like or a bit Slipknot-like or something like that. Would you fancy coming on and singing a chorus? Or, would you fancy coming in and playing guitar? It doesn't necessarily have to be a specific solo artist. If they are in a band, could the guitarist from that band come in and do some bits and bobs? Or, would the drummer from that band make some sort of headway or something like that? Again, it really comes down to where you are, how you songwrite, and whether or not the other artist fits going forward from that, I suppose.
It's risque, isn't it? Don't you think?
It is risky, but I mean, like you say, if the music's good, then the risk is not so risky, is it? Because you've got all of these people. Oh, I'm a purist about the music, and then when someone comes up and goes in some bizarre crossover of like Taylor Swift and Testament, they're going to disregard it purely because Taylor Swift's involved, rather than going, oh, the music. Rather than listening to the music and being like, actually, this is cleverly written, and she sings well, and she does all, she's doing all the right things musically. So if you're a music purist, it shouldn't matter who the artist is, as long as the music sounds good. Bad Life Podcast!